Hi everyone, so today's video is going to be another graphic design book cover making video, but today I'm going to be making book covers in Canva. So usually, as you guys know, I design in Photoshop, and if I'm not designing in Photoshop, I will design in GIMP, which is a free alternative to Photoshop. It's very similar. I used it for a number of years before I switched to Photoshop, and it's what I recommend to people who don't want to buy Photoshop and are trying to make their own book cover. But a lot of people use Canva, which is an online cloud-based designing service. I remember when I was a kid, there used to be one called Picnic, and now I think it's PicMonkey, and then there's obviously also Canva. So Canva isn't something I've ever made a book cover in, so today is my first time playing around in the software, but my mom loves Canva. She always tells me I'm making Canva cards, and I think it's the cutest thing ever. So I made two book covers in Canva, so let's jump into how I made the first one, and then after we'll come back and dispel some thoughts about Canva, if I even recommend it for book cover making, and so on. So let's dive right in. So the first book cover that I made is a young adult contemporary book cover for my novel I'm Disappointed. This is a shelved book. So I first started with a stock image of a silhouette of this boy, and I found a stock image of this paper, and the paper came from a website called unsplash.com. They have really great, like, more photographic stuff. Pixabay.com is what I recommend if you're looking for like vectors or PNGs. What I did with the designing process is I shifted the silhouette so it sort of lined up with the paper, the white paper on the photo, and the major thing here was text placement. So what I used to do when I was a kid, and I used to use a lot of this software, was I used to do individual letter placement. So as you can see, I'm typing out every single letter one by one and placing them. And it takes a while. I think it took me over an hour to fully place everything. But the problem with programs like this is you don't really have much room to do anything, and you don't have very many tools. So individual letter placement is good because it gives you a little bit more room to tilt the letters the way you want them to be tilted, to have different sizes. In a program like this, you need to finagle your way through it a little bit. Another thing I could control in this program was color, and so I made sure to add some color to the novel, which is red. The hardest part about this was placing my name and making it look a bit effortless. My name is pretty long, and so it's a bit tricky. So in a program like this, like I said, there is very little that you can do with like tools. And for some people that's great because not a lot of people want to be playing around with tons of tools. But what I found was most helpful was to take it really, really slow and to often group things together. Like if you press shift and you can click on multiple things at once. And so that allowed me to move things around a little bit more freely, which I did with my name and all of the text. I kept this design pretty simple because, again, in a program like this where you don't have as many advanced tools, simplicity is probably your best bet. So the final thing I did to finish off this book cover was I found some doodles, and they have them in Canva directly, and I imported them and I sort of put them around the brown paper to make it look like someone had drawn directly on the cover, and I think that added a nice, like, young, youthful YA look to the book cover. This is probably like the 5th or 6th book cover I've designed for I'm Disappointed. It was just a lot of finagling and turning down the opacity, which you can do in Canva, and that was about it until I finished up the cover. So this is the final book cover for I'm Disappointed. I am okay, like I'm not super satisfied with how it turned out, but I think it looks pretty good. It was really tricky to find ways to move past the fact that I didn't have all the tools that I'm used to. So my main thing and my main takeaway when it comes to any graphic design is it's all about problem solving. So if you can sort out a way to do something by doing it in the way that you know how to do it, that's how you know that you're a good graphic designer. So graphic designers will problem solve, and if you don't know how to do something, you'll figure a way to do it with the knowledge that you already know. With that in mind, I kept a lot of the knowledge that I knew from using programs like this in the past, such as using like the individual letter placement, which I still do in Photoshop, but I don't have to do it one letter at a time. What I usually do in Photoshop is I have a text, and then I will rasterize the text, and I will use like a lasso tool to move around the tools, or I'll use the transform tool and turn it into the warp tool to really mold the letters a little bit more. But that's a little bit more complicated, and so using a bit more of a simple approach is interesting because it forces you to look at design at a different way, because I knew I couldn't do a design that I typically would have in Photoshop. For example, when I was first thinking about this design, I really wanted to do like maybe some cutouts. So sometimes there are book covers where like the paper looks like it's been carved out, but it's all done in graphic design. And I would have loved to do something like this for this book cover, but I knew it wasn't possible. So I decided to go with something a little bit simpler, and using the tools to my advantage, I was able to create a pretty good finished product. So on the other spectrum, I'm going to be making a book cover for my novel Feeding Habits, which is the book I'm working on right now. And this is the way I would recommend to use Canva. So I first began this cover by finding a stock image of a guy in a forest, and this image I didn't end up keeping, the first one that you're seeing. A majority of this book cover was finding fonts. So a good font can save a book cover that's pretty ugly, because fonts are where the eye is going to draw. And I couldn't find a really nice font for this until the very end. The first image that I'd chosen wasn't working, so I brought in a second image. And here's my first tip with Canva. You can do some visual editing to the photo. So I added a vignette around it to sort of give a bit of darkness around the edges. And the second thing that you can control in Canva is text color. So I decided to use a light gold greenish color for the title font, which matched like the grass in the background. And thinking about color theory, that's a really great way to make a simple design really cohesive. And I ended up finding this font. It's just a capital font, and it is narrow and it's blocky. It looks a lot like a Stephen King book. This is the kind of design I suggest people make in Canva if you are going to make something in Canva. I then added a tagline, which is a quote from the book, and then found a brushstroke overlay, which added a little bit of more complexity to the cover because it was pretty simple before this. That's basically it. I should also note one thing that I could do in Canva was add a drop shadow behind the text. You can't really tell on the final cover. This is the final cover, but what it did do is when I shoved the font up, you could see both of the words feeding and habits are touching at the very top and the very bottom. What happened is because of the drop shadow on feeding, it kind of creates a bit of like a stylized letter. When the habits is hovering over it, you can see a shadow behind habits, which is the shadow from feeding. Essentially, I didn't have a bevel or emboss tool here. I would have loved that, and I would have done that in Photoshop. So I decided, you know what, this is kind of my best bet to creating a bit more texture in the letter itself. A lot of graphic design and a lot of great book covers are going to have a range of textures, and I often like to have texture in the font itself, especially if the background is a bit more busy, which this one was a forest. So that was my little workaround, was using a lot of the drop shadow features. Controlling color was also critical for me because I knew there wasn't anything really else that I could do. Drawing toward a color that was already in the photo itself is a little bit more pleasing to the eye. Also, it pops off of the background a little bit more than if I use like a black font, for example. So now let's chat my final thoughts about using Canva and if I recommend it. Do I recommend Canva if you're making book covers? No, I don't recommend this software for this purpose because it is a lot trickier than I think using a different software would be. But I'm going to put an asterisk. It's a no asterisk because I would recommend this if you can't download another software like GIMP. If this is the only software that you can access, you can make it work. You can make any software work. If you're a good designer, you will find a way to make it work. And this was just a little under 3 hours me testing out this program for the first time. If I had years to practice, I'd probably be a lot better at understanding the little tools that are also in Canva. If you are somebody who's just making book covers for fun and this is the easiest thing for you, I would say go for it. But if you're somebody who's making book covers or is trying to get better at graphic design, you'd like to step up a little bit more from Canva, I would recommend downloading a different software. And in this instance, I would suggest GIMP. So Canva is interesting because it's all in the cloud. That makes me a little bit scared because I wouldn't want to lose everything. The only way you can access that book cover is like on the internet. A teensy bit old school when it comes to that. I like to have a local file that I can back up myself. A software like GIMP is going to give you a lot more range to do a lot of things. You can manipulate things a little bit better. You can rasterize things. You can export to whatever you want in a bit of an easier fashion. If your goal is to level up, I would probably choose a different program. So this is how I would level my answer. Level 1, if you really are just trying to make super simple stuff, you don't really care, you just want to test something out, it's all for fun, then Canva might be a good way to go. Level 2 would be, if you're trying to level up, I would get a different software. In this case, I would recommend GIMP, because you can get a lot of the tools that are a little bit more on par with like professional grade tools in that software. For something super simple, Canva is going to get the job done no matter what. If you don't have like the premium subscription, I don't think you can put in your custom fonts. I may be wrong on that, but I don't think you can. You can only use the fonts that they have. And like I said, a good font can make or break a cover. And what I found really frustrating when I was making the Feeding Habits cover is I couldn't find a font that looked really nice, but was still super readable. So the first one that I was working with, which you saw for a majority of the cover, was really beautiful. It's this font and it looked really nice. The problem was the N was really convoluted looking and you couldn't read it. I could fix that in Photoshop, but in Canva I couldn't. And so I was kind of forced to find a completely different look with the free fonts that they do offer. For me personally, I have the software. I'm privileged enough to have them. I would rather practice in those, but this is definitely not a bad idea if you're somebody who wants to just play around a little bit. But with that said, tools that give us less often prompt us to give them more. And so if Canva's the only software that you have, you're gonna be really great at problem solving. When I was designing one of my first book covers, it was for Fostered. I started designing it in Canva, and this was before like I'd gotten into book covers. The first book cover of Fostered was the first book cover I ever designed. It's a really old one. I don't even know if I can find an image of it. If I can, I'll put it on screen. I actually ended up making the final product in GIMP, but Canva was an interesting experiment. It was definitely tricky for me. I really struggled with it. So let me know what you're doing in Canva, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you in another one. Bye!